The moderator for this panel is Professor Melissa Michelson. Melissa is a professor of political science at Menlo College. She is co-author of 4 books and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles with a research focus on Latino politics, voter registration, and mobilization in minority communities, and persuasive communication on contentious issues such as marriage equality, transgender bathroom access, and other LGBT rights. In her spare time, she knits and runs marathons, and she knits a lot, and she runs a lot, and she runs really fast. So,
wait, I didn't write that part.
She didn't write that part. I did. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa and have at it.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks for organizing this whole day, which I'm glad to see there's such a big audience for, because it's some really important stuff that we're going to talk about. So before I introduce our fabulous panel, I'm just going to give a little bit of background, just in case everyone needs those acronyms defined. So back in June of 2012, President Obama announced DACA, Delayed Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which was aimed at halting deportations by the Department of Homeland Security of certain qualified, undocumented immigrants who had come here as youth. And there were a lot of restrictions in place about who was qualified. But if you qualified, you could then apply for the DACA program and be granted relief from the threat of deportation and have access to a renewable 2-year work permit. And at first, folks sending in their information was a little bit slow because this was in the summer of 2012 and people were worried, oh my God, if I send all this information about my family and where we live and where I've been working and the fact that I'm undocumented and Romney wins, that sounds dangerous. But Obama won, and so, 1 million people eventually sent in their documents. So 2 years later, in 2014, Obama announced what was called the Immigration Accountability Executive Action, where he aimed not only to extend DACA, but also to extend it to apply to parents. And that was DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents. So that was going to add deportation relief to the parents of the folks that were being allowed to stay. That was challenged in court in a case led by Texas and joined by 25 additional states. And Texas won those cases, so DACA was not expanded and DAPA never happened. So now, Trump is president, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen to these DACA folks who already have given the government all their information and what's going to happen. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and ask them to give some introductory remarks, but we're going to keep it pretty brief and go to questions. I have a couple of questions to get us started, and then hopefully folks will have their own questions, and we'll have those roving microphones. So let's see, I will try to go from left to right, right to left. So you already met Andrea Gaytan this morning. She's the director of the AB 540 and Undocumented Student Center here at UC Davis. She's worked in the field of education for over 18 years, originally starting as an ESL teacher, working in Japan, Mexico, and several regions in the US. As director of one of the first student resource centers in the nation dedicated to supporting undocumented students and their families, Andrea has had the privilege of working on behalf of undocumented students in making their original vision a reality. She has been responsible for creating meaningful collaborations across university and community entities, as well as coordinating services such as academic advising, legal consultation, counseling, and financial support in order to better serve undocumented students, their families, and the community at large. In addition, she serves as the university's chief agent on policy, procedural, legal, and student life issues impacting undocumented students at UC Davis. To her left is Melissa Keaney, who is a staff attorney at the National Immigration Law Center, who focuses on promoting the rights of low-income immigrants through litigation, technical assistance, and administrative advocacy. Her main work areas focus on immigration enforcement, with particular focus on programs that permit local law enforcement to collaborate in immigration enforcement. She currently serves on the litigation teams challenging the federal government's revocation of the 3-year DACA and work permits for DACA recipients that was based on the injunction issued by a district court in Texas. Those cases, brought in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, were an attempt to challenge the scope of the nationwide injunction that blocked the expanded DACA and DAPA programs. Ms. Keaney has published a law review article entitled "Restrictionist States Rebuked: How Arizona versus United States Reigns in States on Immigration," which examined how the Supreme Court decision in Arizona further underscored the very limited power states and their law enforcement officers have when it comes to immigration. And to Melissa's left, who's next? Barbara. Next is Barbara Pinto, who is an immigration senior staff attorney at Centro Legal de la Raza. She joined Centro Legal in October 2013 and represents clients in their immigration cases before Citizenship and Immigration Services, the immigration courts, and before the Board of Immigration Appeals. Her work at Centro Legal involves detained and non-detained removal defense, including representation of dreamers, unaccompanied children and families, as well as various affirmative petitions. Barbara is also the supervising attorney of Centro Legal's DACA and DAPA project. Prior to joining Centro Legal, Barbara was the Ralph S. Abascal Fellow at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, where her work focused on providing advocacy, outreach, and legal assistance to immigrants and immigration practitioners about the DACA program. To Barbara's left is Faye Hipsman, who is a policy analyst and California program coordinator with the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. She's based in San Francisco, and her areas of expertise include immigration enforcement and border security, state and local immigration policies, and immigration and politics. Ms. Hipsman joined MPI in 2011 and has published several dozen reports, policy briefs, and migration information source articles on a wide range of immigration topics involving the United States, Mexico, and Central America. In 2016, she became an affiliated scholar with the University of California Hastings College of the Law. Prior to joining the Migration Policy Institute, Hipsman worked as a paralegal at an immigration and nationality law firm in Boston on a variety of deportation, family-based, and employment-based cases. She has also worked at the Brookings Institution and for several immigrant advocacy and civil rights organizations in Texas and Ohio. And last but not least, we have Roy, who you met this morning, who is an undocumented graduate student here at UC Davis, and that's all I'm going to say about him. So we have a fabulous panel, as you now know from these amazing descriptions, brief descriptions of their backgrounds, and so I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a few minutes. And we're going to start with Melissa, who's going to get us up to date on what exactly is happening.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. All right. Thanks, Melissa. And I go by Mel, since we have two Melissas. Maybe it's easier that way. I am a staff attorney at the National Immigration Law Center. And I guess wanted to start by just recapping the last week. It's only been a couple of days into the new administration, but it feels, to me at least, like a lot longer. I don't know how you are feeling, but I think our heads are spinning a little bit collectively, and just hearts are breaking a bit too, just from all of the really dark announcements that have happened this week. So just to highlight some of the sort of big pieces that came out of, we have 2 executive orders right now that have been signed so far on immigration, and we're expecting a third to be signed in about an hour or so on the Muslim ban and refugee ban. But the 2 that we have so far, the first, just a few of the things that came out of them. One was focused on the border, and of course projects spending billions of dollars building the wall, militarizing the border, and essentially destroying border communities. We have the Interior Enforcement Executive Order that proposes a tripling of ICE's manpower, an increase by 10,000 of ICE officers. Also, basically doing away almost completely with the prior scheme of prioritization that we had under the Obama administration. It outlines in the executive order new categories that are, quote, priority categories for enforcement, but they're so broad that they encompass basically anybody who's here undocumented. And then a proposal to essentially defund cities and jurisdictions across the country that have passed policies that aim to protect immigrants and their communities, and to draw a real bright line between policing and immigration enforcement. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on some of those, but the real topic of today's panel, I think, is DACA and DAPA, and wanted to make sure I underscore that there isn't yet any executive order on DAPA and DACA, just a lot of rumors and a lot of just misleading statements that go in every sort of direction from the new administration. We did have a leaked executive order earlier this week that I can kind of outline for you, just the basics of what that said, but it was not signed, and from the latest that we're hearing from the administration, the new president wants to take a few weeks, I think he said 4 weeks, to decide what he's going to do on DAPA and DACA. But just taking from what the leaked memo said, it indicated that there would be a rescission of the 2012 memo, which is the original DACA program, of which we have now a little over 740,000 individuals that have applied and received deportation relief under that program, and that there would be a stop on all processing for new and renewal applications. It did, however, outline a process of just allowing those folks who have DACA currently essentially to fizzle out. So those periods of deferred action and work authorization that they currently hold, nothing would happen to those, so they would be valid for the whatever remaining period they had on them. And of course, I think there's a lot more detail in all of these, and I look forward to your questions to hear what you're most interested in talking about and discussing. But I think these are dark days and really difficult times for the communities that we all care about and work with. I think there are some hopeful signs, though, and I think it's good to try to end on that note, which is, that we're seeing cities, counties, and states across the country really stand up to the new administration. I've been scouring the news for all kinds of stuff from the mayors and various spokespeople from the cities on the quote sanctuary cities issue, and they've been really good. We've only really seen one city so far that it's announced any intention to back down from its existing policy, and I think that's really positive, and would love to talk more about what we think within the law cities and states and counties can be doing to protect residents, because we think that there's actually a lot that's happening, good stuff right now in California and other places. And then also, at least at NILC, and I think probably if any of us are working at nonprofits, we've just been receiving an outpouring of support, offers for help from folks across the movement and other movements that are just recognizing the importance of this moment and reaching out across issue areas and wanting to really show solidarity. And then also, I think just the fact that we don't have any action yet on DACA says so much about the strength of the Dreamer movement, the amount of organizing and just work that's gone into lifting up those stories. And I think if we do see any action on DACA, at least at NILC, and I know a lot of other organizations, we're already prepared to go into court and to be fighting it, so that won't go down without a big fight. So I'll end there and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mel. I'm going to ask the other attorney to go next. So Barbara, if you could make your remarks.
So I just wanted to echo what Mel was saying, the orders that did come down, and I think the ones that are possibly going to be signed are really devastating. They really harm our communities. They don't make our communities safer. They do the opposite. It encourages a lot of collaboration or mandates a lot of collaboration with local law enforcement and agencies with immigration. Also ramp ups enforcement, not only at the border, but in the interior. And as Mel was saying, these aren't priorities because they are so broad that they really do target almost everybody that's living here. And, as a legal services agency, that does a lot of work on the ground, we're just seeing an immense amount of fear and anxiety in the community. Even with current clients that have something that are eligible for relief, that's embedded in the law, it isn't like DACA, and that they have something pending that they qualify for, they're really scared and worried what's going to happen and what the shift in the administration, what that means for them. And there are certain petitions that are taking years to adjudicate because they have certain quotas. And some of those individuals do have certain backgrounds that may make them a priority. And something also to note that's very concerning is the ramping up of detention centers, of creating them, staffing them, and having that, it really cuts against our values, and our values of due process, of our fair day in court. And, you know, a lot of these individuals that are coming in through our border are asylum seekers, are people fleeing horrific persecution, fleeing rape, beatings, torture, and then to be incarcerated as a criminal and not really be able to effectively participate in their case, because a lot of them are going pro se. They're in rural detention centers where unfortunately there isn't a lot of free attorneys, and so they're going against a trained prosecutor. And it's been really difficult for those families. A lot of them are women and children, but also children that have to represent themselves. And of course, there's so many more complications when somebody's detained, whether, you know, they were detained inside or at the border, and being able to participate in their case. It's not the same. They can't meet with attorneys as easily, or they can't go and find an attorney, or be able to navigate the system, or be able to obtain and get different resources in order to pay for an attorney, or to even get the documents necessary to participate in their case. So there's a lot of things that are very wrong with these executive orders, and we're still waiting to see how, even though those are effective immediately, we're still waiting to see how they're going to be implemented. So we haven't yet heard anything from DHS to sort of see how it's going to play on the ground with their attorneys and with their ICE officers and in court. In terms, I guess I'll speak a little bit about DACA. Post-election, we have been seeing sort of an increase in DACA applicants wanting to renew their DACA applications. And after we found out that Trump was elected, our recommendation has been, please go talk to an attorney. Although this may be the second or third time you're submitting this application, you know, the risks are different this time. And so please talk to an attorney, because not everybody should possibly renew. There are risks that need to be analyzed. And so we have been seeing a lot of people coming in, and even though, which was also inspiring, because I thought seeing Trump being elected, a lot of these youth were going to be more afraid and just really take a step back and not want to touch anything. But a lot of them were, no, I have DACA, you know, in case he ends it, but lets these permits expire, I'm going to continue renewing, and I don't have anything to be afraid of, and I want to continue to fight for this. And so that's been very empowering. So we have been seeing an increase in that. We did see that USCIS did adjudicate a lot of those DACA renewals very quickly. And that's what we were hoping they would do, to try to grant as many as possible before the inauguration. And it still remains to see what exactly is going to happen with DACA. And in terms of people that haven't applied for DACA but are eligible, that group is still sort of, I think, waiting to see what's going to happen. We haven't been doing or filing any DACA applications for the first time after the election, and that's been sort of the recommendation nationwide from different organizations, because we're worried now with Trump of flagging individuals that have never been flagged before, that haven't submitted any of their personal information to the government. And so there's some students and youth that are eligible but haven't yet applied for DACA. And so we're waiting to see, and we're hoping that DACA or something better definitely comes about, because And not only that, but just comprehensive immigration reform, because our country really needs it.
That's a good optimistic ending. Okay, next I'm going to ask Andrea to make her remarks.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andrea Gaytan. I'm the director of the AB 540 and Undocumented Student Center here on campus, which is about 2.5 years old and finds itself in the unique position of being kind of in veteran status as far as providing direct support services to undocumented students on university campuses. I think a little bit of our history is that, you know, the creation of our center on our campus is part of a larger system-wide University of California initiative that President Janet Napolitano has funded across all 10 UC campuses. And it really came about in large part because of student advocacy. When President Napolitano first came into office, she was obviously met with a lot of questions about how her history at Homeland Security would translate at, you know, the University of California system. And so I think in large part as a gesture of goodwill and commitment to supporting the undocumented community on campus, and also because of the continued student advocacy, this funding was allocated for initially a 2-year period. I really feel that DACA helped in that situation because so many of our students were empowered and felt protected to be open and upfront in their advocacy, that it's a very tangible result of how a federal policy like DACA plays out on a local level. I think that since then, the creation of, or the implementation of DACA, you know, has definitely benefited our campuses, as well as allowing other policy, or as well as other policies like the California DREAM Act that has also kind of had this interplay that in California has had this huge, you know, positive impact, I think, for the entire state. We've seen our population of undocumented students go from 78 students in academic year 12-13, which was the first year of the California DREAM Act, and also the first year of implementation of DACA, grow to almost 500 students on campus now. And so the need for direct services for these students, as well as revision of our standard traditional policies, not only on our campus, but I think all college campuses across the nation, really needs to be revised, looked at, and reviewed. You know, DACA was never perfect, I think, and we lose sight of that now because we're looking at losing it. It definitely was beneficial, and it has been beneficial. I don't want it to go away, but I think, as the other speakers have mentioned, you know, ideally there would be something permanent, more comprehensive, something that would incorporate parents and family members and not just this small subset of the population, youth, you know, in educational situations that would qualify for it. I think DACA created a sense of security within the community, and we saw a lot of benefits from that within, you know, on college campuses. I mentioned the advocacy before, but I also think understanding that a college education would lead to a career, and the work authorization that goes along with DACA is huge. And, you know, that I think is one of the big negative impacts right now of the uncertainty of the future of the DACA program is really for our students who are working so hard to further their education and, you know, continue their dreams of becoming professionals and contributing back to our state and our country, how to support them in being able to think about employment and a career in the future without really understanding what types of you know, federal policies will be in play by the time they graduate. That certainly is, I think, one of the challenges that I face in the role I'm in right now, and I think that a lot of my colleagues across the UC are also in similar situations, as well as the attorneys who all hear the same questions. You know, what's going to happen to me if this policy is change or worse, if there are direct policies targeting me for deportation. So I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us, and it won't be possible without allies. And so I hope that those of you who are here today, continue to commit to being strong advocates and allies for the undocumented community in whatever capacity you serve in your day-to-day life. I think there's always room for advocacy and allyship. So I look forward to working with you.
Thanks. Next is Faye. You're up.
Can you guys hear me? My name is Faye. I work at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington. I'm just going to start off. I'm going to focus mainly on DACA, and I'm going to start off with some numbers. These are things that at MPI we just tend to track. As someone already mentioned, there are 750,000 current DACA beneficiaries. It's been 4.5 years since the program started. We estimate that 2/3 of the immediately eligible population has applied, so that's about 800,000 out of 1.2 million. The application rates are highest for immigrants from Mexico and Central America. Mexico's application rate is over 80%. It's lower, it tends to be lower for people from Asian countries. It's under 40%. 1/5 of the eligible population actually lives in California, and 1/10 alone is in LA. But Texas and Florida also have large eligible populations. And the renewal rate for DACA is 93%, so that really speaks to the benefits that this program provides. I'll talk a little bit about the future of the DACA program and what we're seeing. I know this is a matter of critical importance to a lot of people here, so I'm happy to share my thoughts, but I'm not an oracle and don't have any inside knowledge. I think there are a couple of important things to look at in kind of trying to see what is happening here. One important thing is to just take stock of some of the recent statements coming out of the Trump administration. So on Wednesday, Trump said in an ABC interview, dreamers shouldn't be worried. Reince Priebus over the weekend, during the weekend shows, said that the administration plans to work with House and Senate leadership as well as to get a long-term solution to the issue. And there was the Time magazine interview with Trump in which he said, we're going to work something out that will make people happy and proud. And so it's significant now that we see these sweeping executive actions touching a range of different things, and DACA is noticeably absent. And just from a Washington perspective, when you see that happening, it suggests that there's some behind-the-scenes work going on behalf of the DACA program. I don't know what that is, but it does appear that that's happening. And the fact that that is even happening is a real testament to the power of the Dreamer movement. And this group really began aggressive activism after the election and have been able to bring some pretty powerful voices on board. So given all of this, one could imagine a scenario in which the Trump administration might not keep DACA as an executive action, they might rescind it, but that they might seek a legislative solution. And already we've seen the Bridge Act be introduced in the last Congress and reintroduced again. So we know that there are people in Congress that are Republicans that are supportive of legislation like that, in addition to Democrats. And what the Bridge Act would do would give DACA beneficiaries what's called provisional protected presence. And a more likely solution or a more likely bill might be something like the SAFE Act, which has also been introduced. And that essentially pairs the Bridge Act with some enforcement provisions. And that's where I'll end.
Thanks. And so you probably have all heard the phrase undocumented and unafraid. It's the big rallying cry of the Dreamers movement. So we have an undocumented and unafraid participant here, Roy, whose last name will not be shared because he is undocumented, but now we can get a direct perspective from Roy.
Hi. So I don't want to be the pessimist in the group, but I kind of have to be. And kind of in contrast to what you're saying about everything we've heard of the news. To be perfectly honest, to me, it feels as if somebody has a gun to your head and then they're saying, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to pull it. The reality of it is there's still that threat. And as much as it feels great to have everyone's support, that doesn't mean that that proverbial gun has gone away. Until something gets passed, until we have assurances, people like me, we're going to be worried. And it's in our nature to worry because worrying is how we've survived in this environment. And when you look at me, you see, again, a grad student at UC Davis. But not everyone is as fortunate as I am to be here. There are people who, we were talking about this earlier, people who live in Arizona, Mississippi, Texas, who don't have the benefit of being able to live in California. And I think that's one thing that we kind of have to really understand, that while we are here, there's a lot of them out there too. And right now, they're even further down the rabbit hole, so to speak. But yeah, we can go on with the panel. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, thanks everyone. All right, so I have a couple of questions that I'm going to start us off with, and I hope you all have questions. We're going to leave time for that. I want to go back first to what Mel was talking about with the sanctuary cities. Tell us a little bit more about what cities and states and schools can do while we wait for Trump to make his decisions.
Sure, be happy to. And a lot of places have already done some of these measures, but I think when we talk about sanctuary cities, it's obviously a term that hasn't been defined, but the right has sort of been using it and defining it on their own. And I think usually when they use that term, they mean to refer to places that have passed policies that limit police. We call it police entanglement in immigration enforcement, but police assistance in immigration enforcement. Usually that's by limiting when police will hold individuals in local jails for additional time on what's called an immigration detainer, and then often through the sort of don't ask policies where they make clear policy that the police aren't to be inquiring about immigration status because it's almost always completely irrelevant to policing duties. And so we see these policies all over the place. There's more than 500 by some counts across the country. So it's not just the LA, San Francisco, Chicago's, and New York's of the country, but really these are viewed as common sense policing and community policing policies that have been adopted in even very red places. So we think, just based on the executive order, that that's largely what Trump is looking to target is places that have adopted these types of policing policies. And I could go into more detail, too, about the executive order and what it says and what we think about Trump's ability to defund and take away federal funding from these places. But besides those types of policies, which I think a lot of places are looking to adopt if they haven't already, another big area of activity and opportunity for state and localities is in confidentiality. The state obviously collects a lot of information. Here in California, we have the AB 60 license, which is a driver's license bill that opened up access to licenses regardless of immigration status. And so the state obviously is collecting a lot of information from residents of California when they apply for these applications. And so we've been working with California and other places. There's 13 states that have such a law now that expand access to driver's licenses in order to ensure that they're doing the most that they can to protect that information that's being submitted to the state from federal access. Similarly, for things like in-state tuition, AB 540, and other measures that states have looked at, have passed, they may be, because of those measures, collecting information from residents that could expose them to immigration enforcement if it was shared with the federal government. And so just looking at really comprehensive confidentiality policies and privacy protections that the state can offer to their residents is, I think, another big pool of work that's happening. And then we're also seeing, mostly in bigger sort of urban cities, but also at the statewide level in California, efforts to fund legal representation, so universal representation measures where cities or states are actually putting their money where their mouth is and actually providing money for residents of the state who are in deportation proceedings, because unlike in criminal proceedings where you have a right to an attorney and the state has to provide one if you can't afford it, when you're in immigration proceedings, you have to pay for an attorney or else you don't get one. And so the state, in some places in the city, is stepping up to be able to fill that gap where individuals can't pay. And I think that's a really important measure that we would define within sort of these sanctuary policies, which we think of as a very big umbrella of sort of spectrum of opportunities that the state and the city can be doing to take measures to protect residents. Also schools, since we're here in the UC, schools are doing a lot right now to try to create safe spaces on campuses. We think, especially with K through 12 schools, the arguments are really strong because there is a U.S. Supreme Court called Plyler that protects the right to an education as a fundamental right for all students. And so that case really provides opportunities for K through 12 schools to do a lot to ensure that ICE isn't allowed on their campuses, that absent a warrant, ICE would not have access to students. And we are seeing all kinds of movement as well at the UCs and also at Harvard. Lots of universities are doing what they can to protect their students. So that's just, I think, some of the areas, and other panelists probably have other ideas.
Yeah, does anyone else want to step in here and talk about that, or chomping at the bit? No? So, sorry, only when on stage in front of hundreds of people do I need to cough. I want to follow up on something you said, Andrea. So we know that the Dreamer movement was very successful, and you said that the creation of the center here was the result in large part to student advocacy. I think a lot of folks out there are probably wondering, well, what can we do now? What kind of advocacy can we do now, maybe at Davis or elsewhere, to help support folks who are undocumented?
I feel a little biased because I feel as though if there's anything that we need on our campus, we can ask and achieve it very quickly. But that says, I think, more about the people in positions of leadership right now. And I think that we were very fortunate when students did begin advocating that we had leadership that understood the immigrant experience, understood marginalization and marginalized communities and the need for safe spaces on our campus. And that dovetailed with the funding that we received from the Office of the President. But we've continued to feel the love, I think, here in Davis, not only on our campus, but in the community. We have members of the community that have, that are here with us today that have really stepped up to show their support as students. We're working right now on things like housing, which in a small college town like Davis is very challenging, but also in urban locations, our counterparts in LA and Berkeley are also struggling to find safe, secure housing and make sure that, students aren't, there's the level of challenge just for students to find housing on a student's budget, but then when you add in undocumented students who may not have the sort of credit history or social security number required by landlords or property management agencies in order to secure housing, it becomes a risky proposition to even look for housing sometimes. So I think that there's still facets of, the day-to-day life that our students are struggling with, and we're definitely working with them to try to find solutions. I think food security is another big one, especially because even though the California DREAM Act has been passed now for several years, it doesn't provide complete funding for students. So there's still a significant gap in funding for students in California, undocumented students in California. And then there are those students who are left out of AB 540 altogether who are paying out-of-state tuition out of pocket, which means over $40,000 a year out of pocket to attend higher education. And that's a huge challenge, obviously, that basically makes it close to impossible. However, there are students who are doing it every day. And so I think that, obviously there's advocacy, and then there's just the need to be boots on the ground, open up the purse strings sometimes and have to help in ways that is not always the easiest for everyone, but we're definitely looking at ways that we can continue to fundraise for our students and just divert funds. If students lose the opportunity to work or have work authorization, this is going to be a huge financial impact for students' ability to pay for things like food and housing, as well as books and other instructional materials. So I think that in general, continued advocacy on a policy level is required, and I think that we have a lot of national organizations as well as state agencies and organizations that are doing a great job, and students are definitely jumping on to help themselves and continue that. And then there's the local level of support and advocacy that comes with just meeting the basic needs of our students.
Does anybody else, thank you. Does anybody else want to speak to that? Roy, do you have anything you want people to do?
I think one thing that you can do for the individual is that if somebody has trusted you enough to let you know of their status, that's not something that's lightly given. I know, I mean, it seems like it's something that I'm lightly giving right now, telling you that I'm undocumented, but it's not. If somebody comes up to you and tells you, hi, I'm undocumented, make sure you treat that like it is a gift. And that'll mean so much more than, well, I don't know if it means more than food in their stomachs when they're hungry, but at the end of the day, it does a lot. It does a lot. And simple things like that, really. And a lot of you are professors, a lot of you are TAs, and a lot of you are fellow students to them. And these things just go such a long way.
Thanks. All right, I have one more question, and then I'm going to open it up. And I'm not really sure who this is for, so whoever wants to jump in. Renee was speaking earlier this morning about how we used to be under this different regime for prioritizing who would be detained. And it does make me wonder, does the existing executive order that Trump has already signed predict that folks who are in the undocumented community who were protected by DACA, are they going to be prioritized now? Is there any sense of, Mel already says no, but is there any sense of, like, does, what is the likelihood that they'll be prioritized for deportation or detention?
Nothing in the memo so far says that DACA recipients will be prioritized for enforcement, but the enforcement priorities do really widen what the priorities mean. So they now include most criminal convictions, a lot of terrorism grounds, anyone who's been charged of a crime, and some kind of vague language about behavior that may constitute a crime. So, I mean, the difference, the November 2014 priorities under President Obama effectively protected 87% of the unauthorized population. It offered some degree of protection from deportation. And I think we can say for sure that the Trump priorities make that share a lot smaller because a lot more people will become priorities.
And just to add a little bit, and it's also unclear what will happen once these DACA recipients don't have DACA to protect them. So if there is another executive order that takes away DACA and invalidates these work permits and this protection, then they are subject to these broad priorities. And a lot of DACA recipients would be subject to it. So if there isn't anything else sort of excluding them specifically, then they are at risk. And this is really scary, not only for them, but for the undocumented population. And we're still waiting to see exactly what the Department of Homeland Security is going to do and exactly how they're planning to implement the executive order with the priorities, because it has been said time and time again, our government does not have the resources to deport the 11 million or however many are here undocumented. And so that's why with prior administrations, we've had, even though they haven't been great either, but we've had priority memorandums that sort of specify who the government's going to focus enforcement and detention on and who they won't. And so we're still waiting to see, and I think that's the biggest, or at least for me, the biggest question, because the executive order doesn't match the resources that are out there. But I think that's also the case for other aspects of the executive order, that they call for a huge ramp up in enforcement and officers and the border, and I think these are resources that we may not have.
And just to add one other point, I think there's a real emphasis in the executive order on getting police more involved in immigration enforcement. And I think at least at the National Immigration Law Center, our concern with that in combination with this prioritization is the fact that it's going to be precisely the jurisdictions that have the history of civil rights and racial profiling abuses that are going to be most likely to sort of jump on board, want to sign things like a 287G agreement, which deputizes their officers to act like immigration agents, and that that the fact that the Trump administration, for example, considers as a priority any individual that's been charged regardless of the outcome of the charge means that police have an incentive essentially to use the ability to arrest on whatever trumped up pretextual cause they have as a way to facilitate an immigration check and potentially deportation. And I think we saw that happening a lot with the birth of secure communities in the early years of the Obama administration, and that because of, I think, a lot of the organizing and work that went into opposing secure communities, we saw the prioritization memos come out of that, and then the end to secure communities. One of the things that happened in this week's executive order is the rebirth of secure communities. So I think there's a lot of concern about the interplay between this emphasis on using state and local law enforcement resources and the fact that there really is no sense of prioritization that's happening.
Awesome. All right, so if you have a question, and I suspect people have questions, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone.
You want me to start?
Brad gets to go first because he's the organizer.
So other than that, what's the bad news? Actually, this one is for Faye. So you talked about, the Bridge Act and maybe legislative remedies. I wonder, sort of, what's your opinion on the likelihood of something like that actually happening in this Congress? And that's it.
Sure. I mean, you can never say with certainty that something like this has a chance or not. The conditions are constantly changing. And there's a huge division, even within the Republican Party on this issue. And so it's hard to imagine huge division. So they're going to have to overcome that, and that is going to take intense, painstaking negotiations. And, we saw during the last immigration reform debate that the House wasn't able to do it. But that said, in some ways, having a Republican-controlled White House, House, and Senate gives the party more room to work those differences out and bigger numbers to gain support. And I'll say that, politicians, there are some powerful voices behind this legislation, and politicians don't really stick their necks out for something that they just believe in. They're hearing concerns from their constituents, and they know that they'll get cover on the issue. So I think that's a positive sign that so many people do clearly support it. But then again, the opposition is fierce and it's loud, and it just remains to be seen whether that can be overcome. So sorry, I can't answer.
The other thing I wanted to say, and I don't want to make this, I guess, even more negative, but the Bridge Act doesn't have a path to citizenship. So it doesn't grant them lawful permanent residence, and it won't allow those, if it does pass and people receive it, citizenship eventually. So although it would be beneficial and it would be an added protection, it's still not enough. And it still doesn't really solve the immigration issues that we have. So just like with DACA, where we have youth that are sort of in this legal limbo, I think it'll still exist with the Bridge Act, and where maybe they'll continue to renew this provisional status, but at the same time, they'll just have nowhere to go from there, and it'll still be a population that we need to sort of address and yeah, so although it is a step forward, it's still not what we need, and it doesn't even begin to sort of solve the problem.
Hello? Oh, yes, it's on. Hi, so this question is more for Mel and Barbara. I know that with considering all of the uncertainty and the influx of people that have been coming in to receive legal services, what are you planning to do to be able to serve all of these people? Because I can imagine that depending on what happens every day, what gets announced every day, how are you going to handle the influx of people that are going to be coming in for representation?
It's a very, very good question, and something we've been dealing with a lot. And although definitely with Trump and these executive orders, there will be a huge influx, but we can't forget the sort of the influx that we have been seeing, right? We're in a refugee crisis, and that hasn't even been addressed, and there's so many individuals out there in need of representation, children that are going against prosecutors and have to defend for themselves in court, mothers and children in court. So from a legal services agency, it sort of feels like we're not even done addressing or helping that population, and then moving on to the next crisis. So it's been really difficult. We've definitely resources help. We definitely need way more attorneys, more legal staff to be able to address the needs. And we've been working with, for example, in Oakland, we've been working with the city of Oakland and private foundations, and also with Alameda County in order to develop and hopefully fully fund a rapid response network. So we understand that there's a lot of organizations in place now, but if we really join our forces and really ramp up resources, we can really respond in an effective manner. So right now the model is if there were a raid or ICE does come and pick somebody up, that there's a number that they're gonna call. And community organizers will be there 24/7 sort of answering the calls, and we'll have a team of first responders that go out that sort of assess the situation, make sure the kids are safe, make sure sort of assess what's happening, who came, was it ICE, the police, and gather all the information needed, and then that after that is received, sort of sparking then a team of lawyers to go immediately to the where ICE holds people initially before they get booked into the jails, which is in San Francisco on Sansom, employing teams there to sort of assess what's going on and have attorneys present when ICE interrogate and question people. And then also immediately try to help people if they are eligible in their bond proceedings and their immigration court proceedings and so on. And so right now that's what we're trying to focus on. It hasn't been as greatly received as we thought. So although resources and funding has come in, it definitely isn't nowhere near trying to meet the need of really funding and making like a regional response. And of course the idea would be that then it would be sort of a state response, an even bigger response, where these teams would be set up in different cities or counties that can respond right away. And that's also part of one of the legislations that are pending at the state level, is whether we can fund attorneys for everyone in removal proceedings.
I'll just respond really briefly because we're a national organization that does impact litigation, not direct services. So our role, I think we operate more on the sort of train the trainer, and so trying to arm individuals and direct services organizations like La Raza or Centro, sorry, with as much information and technical assistance as we can, so that they have what they need to be able to serve the community, doing a lot of know your rights, but then trying to operate on that train the trainers model, where folks that are in the know your rights are actually then going out and doing their own know your rights and developing materials that would just facilitate that. And then also, I think I talked about the solidarity, signs of solidarity from across the board, different movements, progressive movements, and also even law firms. And so we've been working on creating models to plug in all those offers of support and help and resources, because right now it just feels like everyone's running around and there's a lot of duplication of efforts and just a lot of confusion. And so trying to figure out how best we can set up things like RAID's response networks. We have one in LA that's been around for a couple of years that we're using as a model to try to replicate, but figure out the best way to effectively plug in all the people who I think really do want to help out.
Reminded me, one last thing, sorry, is something else that allies can help with is we need help in sort of disseminating the information so that immigrants know their rights if ICE comes to their door, if the police or ICE stop them on the street. You know, we have constitutional rights that apply regardless of status and regardless of these executive orders and regardless of who's president. So we've been doing a lot of those Know Your Rights presentations, not only to immigrants and community members, but also to allies, to teachers, to health service providers, so that they can then pass on the information. And there's a lot of handouts. There's also red cards that are distributed by the ILRC that sort of have in Spanish and English. Unfortunately, those are the only two languages I've seen them in, that explain the rights that people have under the Fourth and Fifth Amendment to remain silent, to not open the door, and to sort of make sure they state those things regardless of where they're at in the process, whether they encounter ICE at the jail, on the street, at their home, or they're already detained, right? These rights continue, and we see too frequently people giving up those rights. So that's another way that people can help.
Hi, my question is for Melissa from NILC. Have you or you all at NILC been looking into the law and the case law around sanctuary cities and federal funding? I'm wondering sort of what your quick take is on it, and specifically whether or not how tied the funding how germane it has to be to what it's defunding, and worry of course about something like Department of Transportation withholding funds from California if they don't divulge the data they have on the AB60 licenses, something like that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question, and not to make your eyes glaze over, because I definitely spend all my days doing this work right now, and so I won't go into like a lot of detail about the case law, but I think we are in a good position. We have a really robust legal memo that's out there that's being shared with local electeds and mayors and others that have these types of policies to give them the sort of legal backing that they need to feel like they're on solid ground. But I think in direct response to your question about the funding, the executive order talks about all federal grants. Of course, it leaves a lot vague in terms of how they're going to define sanctuary cities. It's up to the discretion of the Secretary of DHS, and it's defined as violations of a single federal statute, 8 U.S.C. 1373, which is a very limited statute, and I can say we've analyzed the various, quote, sanctuary policies across the country, and none of them violate 8 U.S.C. 1373. There was just a really good court case out of Northern District of California, a San Francisco court, that found San Francisco's policy did not violate the same federal statute that's cited in the executive order. So I think legally we're on solid footing, but I'm not sure that matters at all to this administration. And so whether they actually withhold the funding, and then I think this is gonna be in a court somewhere near us soon, and hopefully in the Ninth Circuit. I think it's gonna come to a head.
Are there any examples of money being withheld by the federal government and then the city suing and winning to get that money back?
Not on our issues, not on, quote, sanctuary cities, but there's the South Dakota v. Dole case, which had to do with highway funding around the minimum drinking age. Then there's the more recent ACA case, Sebelius, that was around Medicaid funding, where the court basically, we're getting into very interesting, there was some debates earlier around lunch I heard around the states' rights arguments, and traditionally our movement hasn't really been a major pusher of states' rights, but I think that we're finding ourselves really friendly with the 10th Amendment right now, because that's the basis for it, right, is that the federal government can't coerce local agencies to do their work. They can't commandeer those local resources. And so in the case of the Medicaid law, the court there said that was like a gun to the head because they were threatening to withhold all Medicaid funding if they didn't do the Medicaid expansion. And that wasn't a germane enough or close enough relationship. And it was also a huge chunk of their money. So I think in all, it's helpful that the executive order talks about federal grants generally and wasn't specific to law enforcement grants, for example, or more sort of specific funding streams that might relate more directly to sanctuary cities. But I think we don't know yet. So the devil's in the details, and we'll have to see exactly what happens with the implementation of the executive order to know. But it will be fought. We're talking with a lot of cities and states right now, and they're sort of arming up to go to battle. So.
So kind of following along this question of the potential impact to sanctuary cities, there was a threat floated to campuses that if you try to declare your campus a sanctuary campus, similarly that you might face withholding of federal funds for student financial aid or some other programs, and yet that wasn't included in that recent executive order. Have you seen any other movement on that question specifically, or how likely is it that campuses might be able to have a cause of action similar to cities, if that was the case? And then the other question I had actually was for Faye on this issue of the Bridge Act. And it's more of a strategic question, which is, say that the Republicans are successful, say that it passes and say that it is signed. What's the implication of effectively protecting one very small population of the immigrant community and in effect trying to peel them off as kind of Republican supporters, right, and holding them up as somehow the effectiveness of a Republican agenda on immigration? Is there not a danger there in sort of allowing that kind of peeling off of that one segment of the population?
I think there's definitely a debate within the immigration advocacy community about whether to accept this like piecemeal immigration reforms and whether it's better to allow those pass and accept kind of what you can get, which tends to be the low-hanging fruit, so easier things to address. Dreamers is one of them. Whether that should be the approach or whether to hold out for a comprehensive, broader bill. And I think certainly in the next 2 to 4 years with a Republican-controlled legislature and White House, the chances are there's a chance for something like a dream bill, but the chances for broader relief to the unauthorized population are in my opinion, very small. And so that is a question that the advocacy community is going to have to grapple with and decide whether they're going to support it and whether that's acceptable.
Can I just clarify? I think my question is not so much about my question isn't so much about whether you will be successful or you may be successful in acquiring these protections or services. It's the degree to which that then legitimates this presidency and their agenda on other immigrants, so that it is allowing a successful piece of legislation that they then get to hold up as, and tout as being, this is the way to go on immigration, and we are right across the board, right? There's good cause for us to go after everybody else, and this is the only way to interpret immigration.
Yeah, I think that is certainly a risk. If you peel off one small population, it may open everyone else up to risk because lawmakers feel that they were generous in one area and don't have to be generous in another area. But again, I think there are even people in the Republican Party who do support comprehensive immigration reform and won't support a policy of mass deportation for moral and political reasons. And so I think that is definitely a risk, but I don't think it ensures it at all.
Before I address the specific question about schools, I also want to add another factor, which is at what expense too. I mean, as Faye mentioned in her initial comments, I think the Bridge Act and other similar measures have often been paired with increased border funding and border measures, enforcement measures like the SAFE Act, which are extremely dangerous. And at least at the National Immigration Law Center, one of our priorities is that these are really difficult decisions about what sort of compromises can be made or not, and that they should be made by the community that's directly impacted by the measures. And so even in the past history on this, UWD, one of the forefront dreamer groups on these issues, has really come out in opposition to the idea that we would compromise on a lot of enforcement measures in order to get a small measure of relief for a small percentage of the population. But I think that it's really groups like that and other directly impacted community members that should be at the forefront and at the table, especially in those really tough negotiations. On the question about sanctuary universities, I haven't heard anything about that. It's certainly not in the executive order. I think it's not going to be the first target at all. And especially with all of the rhetoric from the Trump administration around criminal aliens, I think that we can definitely expect that they're going to be looking at police and jails and sort of this merging that's happened with the state criminal justice system and immigration enforcement over the last several years. That's where they're going to really put their emphasis for some time. And so I think it's going to be the cities that have policies around that are really going to be targeted. And I think there's a lot that the universities can and should be doing with very minimal risk at this point to try to protect their students.
Hello. This is complex stuff. I guess I have two basic questions, one of which is, what are the current ways or pathways to citizenship? And also, what are the hurdles with those pathways to citizenship? Thank you.
I don't know that that's so basic, actually.
To my understanding, it's either get married or nothing.
But isn't there a military option?
I don't know, actually, because I remember when I was younger, and this was granted like 20 years ago when my sister was about graduating from high school, she tried to join the military, or maybe it was the Navy, but then once it came out that she was undocumented, basically she was turned away.
There are a certain limited number of slots for folks who are undocumented, so not everyone gets accepted, but. Right, it's a limited program. All of these programs are limited. So one way is to get married, but then there's a limited number of slots for qualified undocumented immigrants that you can basically trade your military service for becoming documented. So
Yeah, and
that doesn't always work either.
it's only under the MANV program, so it's not like broad military or any sort of arm of the military. And in terms of forms of relief, I mean, there's so many forms of relief. And not even if you had sort of a qualifying relative, let's say you did have that spouse or that parent or that sibling or somebody that could petition for you, that doesn't mean that you're eligible to receive permanent residency. And I think, when I tell that to clients, it's sort of the shocker, and it's just like, what? Like, finally, we have somebody in the family that was able to obtain that status, and that person wants to petition me. And then in hearing about sort of the long wait, but also that they may not be eligible to receive it. And that's why we do have a lot of mixed status families in the US. And we have couples that are married to citizens that can't adjust and they can't fix their status. So it's sort of complex, and each sort of form of relief has its requirements, its exceptions. So it's a little bit more complicated, but hate to sound like an attorney, but really go speak to an attorney. So anybody that that's sort of asking, like, maybe I'm eligible for this or that, they really should consult with an attorney. And do so kind of frequently, because things are changing, and things change really quickly. So if they haven't met with somebody in the past year, they should do so. So there's different ways. And we can give sort of referrals to different organizations and different trusted attorneys in the area. Because that's another thing, is making sure the person goes to a place that isn't going to screw them over, or that isn't actually going to do more harm than good. And there are also immigration consultants or notarios that aren't authorized to practice law in the United States, but still do so. And so to be wary about those things.
Yeah, and if you're in Davis, you can come and talk to me, and I can put you in touch with our attorneys. If you aren't a student or family member of a UC Davis student, we also work with the local legal service agency that will serve alumni, staff, faculty, community members as well for free, and are reputable, great attorneys. And I think a really important thing that has come up on our campus in particular has been marriage petitions, and this idea that, oh, if I just marry a US citizen, I can apply for my citizenship afterwards. And that's not entirely true. As was stated, it really depends on your personal circumstance and how you entered the country, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to see an attorney before you actually marry anyone to make sure that that remedy is going to work for you, and that, it's a legitimate marriage besides. So make sure that you get legal counsel before you start making lifelong commitments or legal commitments, please.
So I know we have immigration attorneys here, and my question might be a little bit more of employment law, but something that I haven't seen being touched upon much is the new state bills, SB 1159, which came into effect in 2016, allowing for undocumented immigrants in California who don't have a social security number but have an ITIN number issued from the IRS to essentially be able to apply for licensure under the Department of Consumer Affairs. This seems to me like an option, or at least a way that, at least particularly for students maybe that are concerned about losing DACA and sort of seeing like the end to career options. Can you touch upon how can we maximize SB 1159 so that students, are thinking and looking into the possibility of being independent contractors, and how would that look, I guess, in the larger context, like, because they can still be self-employed. I mean, is this something that could potentially be, be threatened? I just haven't heard much about it, and I wanted to, anybody that can provide more insight, I guess. Thank you.
It's definitely outside my traditional area of expertise, but it's something that NILC works on. Professional licenses, I think, is a really important way in which states can provide new opportunities. But as you said, I think inherent in your question around being self-employed, I mean, it doesn't provide work authorization. Only the federal government can do that. And there have been some talks around states trying to provide work authorization on their own, but I think it really runs into conflict with federal law and our arguments around federal preemption, which have mostly been helpful to us in the past. And so there are limits, I think, to what the state can do there, but I think where you live in a state that does offer that, it's a good option for some people that I think we should be encouraging folks to take advantage of, but it can only go so far because there's still the issue of whether or not the person has work authorization if they want to seek employment through an employer.
Hi, thanks. I have a few just fragmented thoughts that I'd like to throw out there, and hopefully you'll chew on and think out loud. Number one is I think I'd like to elaborate, or for someone to elaborate on that Plyler decision, because I do think that the little I know about it seems very important as far as students that are already in school under, what is it, AB 540. And I heard about an email that was sent out, I think from the chancellor's office here, or maybe from the president's office. I don't know if it was UC-wide or if it was just Davis, that sort of encouraged programs and teachers to keep undocumented students under protections, under UC protections for as long as possible, keep them in classes and sort of run up against that credit cap in order to extend the protections to those students. And then a thoughtful response that that considered that if we move students through the system, then it creates new spots for students to come in and be protected. So, like I said, a few fragmented thoughts, and maybe someone can elaborate on that. Thanks.
Yes, so I think that one of the topics of discussion and one of the big questions right now that a lot of students are confronting is whether they should prolong their stay, and kind of stretch out their undergraduate career, and instead of, graduating in 3 or 4 years, take that 5th year and add a major or a minor. And there's not really any immigration protection under AB 540 or the California DREAM Act. That is simply, AB 540 only really speaks to in-state residency for tuition purposes and not for immigration purposes. So there's no added protection necessarily or per se by staying in the university. But there is definitely a sense of possibly support and resources on campus, a sense of being able to thrive, whereas in the professional or career world, it may seem a little bit more difficult or challenging to find maybe a foothold without work authorization. And so there's that discussion happening, and then there's the opposite discussion also happening in that a lot of students are thinking, I need to get out of school as quickly as possible, maybe return to my home community, be closer to family members, and kind of, circle the wagons, so to say, in order to be with my community and be closer to family and available, especially if you have younger siblings or whatnot. There's also a lot of talk about, fast forwarding graduate school or professional school and looking into, instead of taking a gap year, going right into graduate school after finishing undergrad. So there are a lot of, I think, things to consider and discuss. Of course, right now, it's all based on the speculation that DACA will be ending sometime sooner in the near future. And so I think that is, in large part, it's an individual's choice to decide and determine for themselves what's best for their situation. But we're here at the center trying to make sure that they have all of the information they need in order to make the most informed decision possible.
I'm sorry, I know there are lots of unanswered questions out there, but we are at time and we get to have a break before our last panel of the day. So I want to thank all the fabulous panelists for their participation.